Hi, this is Jennifer Sardina. I'm doing my final project for the class African American Influence in Latin American Film. The project I'm doing is on the history and influence of the Garifuna culture. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the history behind it, how the culture was formed. I'm going to be talking about cultural aspects in the past and in present day. And I'm also going to be discussing the influence of the Garifuna culture on the Latin American world today, specifically on music and cinema. To begin with, Garifuna, or Garinagu as they were referred to in the past, is a mixed ancestral group that were descended originally from Carib, Arawak, Western African people who are living along the Caribbean coast in Belize, Guatemala, St. Vincent, Nicaragua, and Honduras. In the modern day, due to economic problems in these home countries, many Garifuna have immigrated to the United States, and there are current communities in LA, Miami, and the greatest population is in New York City. The history of the Garifuna people began in 1635, when two Spanish slave ships, which were heading towards the West Indies, sunk near St. Vincent. To avoid being sent to prospective slave owners, the slaves adopted the native culture and the native language and ended up intermarrying with the local women. The disputes between France and Great Britain over the territory actually led to the Garifuna culture acquiring some of this French influence. The War of Exile, which was this conflict between England and France, was England versus the Garifuna-French alliance for the land because the English wanted to have sugar cane plantations in that area. One important aspect of this war was Chatelier, as some of the Garifuna people adopted French name. Chatelier was a Garifuna who he was convinced of his paranormal powers and thought he was invincible. He actually lost to Alexander Leith, who was an Englishman, in a duel. And due to this, the Garifuna-French alliance, he was sort of their leader for a while, and they were sort of unsure of what to do. And after a year more of just sheer war exhaustion, the Garifuna finally surrendered to the English. This led to Garifuna expatriatism, where the English didn't really like the large number of Garifuna people in their new territory, so they ended up shipping them in boats to Honduras. There, the deportees settled down into the new area, and they actually gradually migrated around the Central American coast, and ended up preserving their own cultural identity. One of the really interesting things about the Garifuna culture is their language. They have a very interesting language. It's called Garifuna, and it's an Arawakan language that was derived from Arawak and Carib, with English, French, and Spanish influences all kind of mixed in. The really interesting thing about this language is that there were different vocab terms that were used by the men in the community versus the women. They had different words that you could use if you were a man or if you were a woman. Another interesting aspect is almost all Garifuna are bilingual or polylingual in some way. Due to the areas they live, they preserve their native language while still adopting the language of the country they're in. Another very important aspect of the Garifuna culture that's probably the most distinctive is their music. Their music is very different from the rest of Central America. They have a really famous type of song and dance. It was called the punta. It's an African courtship dance where the dancers move their hips in circular motion. This was done for holidays, social events. All this song and dance was basically centered around holidays. One example of a holiday was the sorry, this is hard to pronounce, Wanaragua, or the John Canoe, where participants would wear white masks and they would go from house to house doing this song and dance to receive food from their neighbors. This was performed around Christmas time, and it was initially to mock the white slave owners. In all of the music and ceremonies, drums are kind of the key thing for the Garifuna people. Drums are very important. There's two types of drums, the primero, which is the tenor, and the segunda, which is a bass. Also, like African culture, which does include these drums, they also use the call and response patterns that are typical of African music. They have a lot of songs that they use not only for ceremonies, but sort of for everyday life. Two examples of these are the Erem Wu Yu, which is sung by women making cassava bread, and then there's Leremuna, yeah, Beramuna, which is sung by the men while they work together, unlike a job. This type of their music has actually had a very big influence on modern culture, especially in Latin America, because the punta, which is their most famous type of music, actually evolved with the invention of the electric guitar, and this became known as punta rock. Some artists today were Andy Palacio, Children of the Most High, and Black Coral. And this music has become extremely popular throughout the Caribbean, not just in Garifuna communities, and through this you can sort of see how their cultural music has impacted Latin America in many different ways. Another very different thing about the Garifuna culture that makes them distinct from our society and from the societies in Latin America is their gender roles. They're very different than, especially like Latin American culture, where it's all about machismo and all about the man being in charge. The Garifuna are actually a matrilocal society, and many women bear children without any kind of permanent or legal relationship with the father. The women are the ones who are in control of the household, and they basically rely on men for their income, and that's about it. It's also very common for a man to have a numerous amount of girlfriends as well as his wife. Well, wife in that kind of sense. And another thing about men is that although they're not the head of the family, it's considered that there is an extreme spiritual connection between the father and a newborn son. So anytime a son is born, the father will take time off of work, take time off of doing whatever he's doing, and just spend time with his newborn son. This spiritual connection leads to another aspect of the Garifuna culture that's really important, which is their religious beliefs and their folklore. Primarily, their folklore of the past consisted of this traditional type of witchcraft in the Caribbean, which was called obeya, yeah. And that's legal today, but it still does exist. The rituals involved, they were sort of involving dancing, drumming, and they would use these trances to communicate with the dead. They also involved spell casting, which was one of the things that sort of made it illegal today. Some of the spells they used, Pujinga doll is what it's called, and it was sometimes used in spell casting. It's a doll made of cloth that's stuffed with black feathers, and then it was buried under the victim's doorstep. Another thing they did, they would have crosses painted on the children's forehead to ward off the evil eye. Obviously, the religion has slightly changed today because these practices have been deemed illegal, and the modern-day religion for the Garifuna culture is actually a version of Catholicism. But this version of Catholicism actually incorporates many of the aspects of their traditional religion. It combines the belief in the traditional Catholic saints with a reverence towards what's known as Gubida, which are the ancestral spirits, and buwiyes, which are shamans or spirit helpers. These religious practices that they incorporated their ceremonies and stuff included drumming, dancing, singing, and the consumption of alcohol to communicate with the spirits. And these were definitely frowned upon, and the Garifuna people were often accused of devil worship by some of the Orthodox churches. One of the really important religious traditions is the dugu. It was an important dance ritual that was involved anytime a family member died or there was a family illness. And in this one, a large feast is prepared, and all the guests dance and sing the traditional dugu song. And this is led by a buwiye, who is the shaman, and he calls forth the gubida, which is the ancestral spirit. The food and rum of the feast is then offered to the spirit, and then afterwards all of it is thrown into the sea or buried to sort of represent the gubida accepting this offering. One thing that's definitely changed, for the most part, in most Garifuna communities is living conditions. Initially, all the houses were made of wood, or they were made of wattle and daub, which are woven sticks basically held together by clay. They always had thatched roofs, and the wooden houses were actually raised off the ground on posts, so that if there was any water or any flooding, it wouldn't be a big deal. Today, obviously, a lot of the Garifuna communities have modern housing, and that really isn't the case. But there are some traditional villages, and many of them still don't have electricity. Traditional clothing, the women would wear full, bright-colored skirts that were trimmed with shells and would wear kerchiefs on their head, while the men wore traditional straw hats. Obviously, that's something that's completely changed today, and actually modern clothing is absolutely modernized and kind of westernized. They wear no different from the clothes we would wear or anyone in Europe would wear. That's just totally and completely changed. Another thing that's still held true, though, throughout the centuries is their food. They have food staples including rice, fish, green bananas, and plantains. And then accompanied with this, they had coconut milk. And sort of all the major recipes you can find kind of include these ingredients sort of mixed together, usually like plantains boiled in coconut milk is a typical starch. But then one exception to this is cassava bread, which is actually made from the cassava roots, which are ground up and made into bread. Now, the most important part of this presentation I'm sort of giving is trying to relate this back to Latin America and Latin American cinema and show how Garifuna is kind of having an effect. And I found a perfect example of this online. It's the movie El Espíritu de mi Mamá. It's by Ali, and it was this dramatic tale of this woman's journey to her forgotten homeland. And it's about this woman named Sonia, who is a Garifuna single mother, and she's living in Los Angeles. She finds herself being haunted by memories of her dead mother and memories of this American soldier that she used to be in love with. After she ends up getting fired from her job, she ends up traveling to Honduras and discovers her past and discovers the Garifuna culture. And she slowly learns more about the ceremonies and the rituals, and it ends up affecting her greatly. And so she transfers all that discovery onto her own daughter and teaches her about her history as well. And I think this film is really a perfect representation of everything this class has been communicating. It really demonstrates the influence of African Americans not only on Latin American cinema, but on Latin America itself. It shows the innate desire for people to try to preserve their cultural integrity, and also allows the cultural integrity to transfer into the realm of Latin American film. The Garifuna culture is a powerful example of the influence of African American descendants Alright. Garifuna culture is really a powerful example of how African American descendants have affected Latin American culture. And the film, El Espíritu de mi Mamá, shows this influence is clearly evident not only in Latin America, but in Latin American cinema as well. Alright, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.